Thanks, Liz. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope your spring's off to a good start. We have a lot to cover. Like Liz said, this is a big topic and kind of a new webinar topic for us. So we're excited to do this, talk about all the different operational checks that we typically see, working with about 700 agencies across the country, some of the most common ones, and different best practices and recommendations that we have. So if you haven't already, go ahead and fill out that poll really quick, and we'll give that just a few more seconds here, and we'll close that out. And we'll give that 5 seconds. Okay, there we go. And I think Liz is going to share the results with us. Awesome. So looks like a good mix today of different agencies. About 60% are paid, 40% combination or volunteer. 60% currently using PSTrax. So welcome back for you all, and 40% are new agencies. So thanks for joining us for the first time today. How are you currently documenting your checks? 60% paper spreadsheets, 20% PSTrax, 20% another system. What is the value of the assets you're tracking? Kind of a mix across the board, and we'll talk about some of those different equipment items as well as we move through. Okay, so let's get rolling here. Checklist 101. There's a lot of different types of checklists and different regulation and kind of governing bodies that put the checklists and the guidelines together. Obviously, the big one in the fire industry, as you all know, is NFPA, the National Fire Prevention Association, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in the next few slides. In addition to that, there's other government kind of governing bodies, OSHA, depending on what state and what type of agency you are, you may have to abide by the OSHA regulations, and there's different checklists for equipment and vehicles that they put out there. In addition to that, your state has a Department of Transportation agency. A lot of times the fire departments have different checklists or requirements that tie back to DOT and what they put in place. If your agency does any controlled substance tracking, there is obviously the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, that has regulations for those that you have to follow. And then on top of all that, a lot of times different states, I have Texas here as an example, different states will have their own kind of checklist and governing body. So in Texas, it's the Texas Commission for Fire Protection. And obviously there's different ones of those for different states. But there's a lot of these different associations and entities, and we'll kind of go into each one a little bit from a high level and talk about how it impacts you as a fire department. So starting off with NFPA, there's about 300 codes and standards that they have in place, and you can actually reference these for free if you go to NFPA.org. You can pull them up online and view them for free. And so what I thought we'd do is spend the next 54 minutes kind of going through the 300 codes and standard. No, I'm just kidding. We won't do that. That'd be a lot of fun, going through all of them. But I did pull up some of the most pertinent ones. These are the ones that we see most commonly, as we're building out checklists for different agencies across the country. Obviously, there's a lot more than this, so this is just kind of scratching the surface. But on your vehicles, NFPA 1911, that's a really crucial one that talks about your engine, chassis checks, repairs. On top of those checks and checklists, a lot of departments also do a full inventory check where they go compartment by compartment and actually, check off the equipment and the inventories inside those compartments. So on the vehicle side, that's a huge checklist, or multiple checklists, but a huge area that essentially every department has in place. On the PPE side, there's NFPA 1851 and 1877, which are for structural and wildland gear. And within those standards, you have different events, right? Different checklists or inspections that need to be completed. There's routine inspections, advanced inspections, cleanings, exposure events, which is obviously a really big topic these days, and then repairs. So when those things break, when the gear breaks, whether it's a jacket with a hole in it or a rip in the sleeve, whatever it might be, how do you take care of those repairs and document that information? Same thing on the SCBA side. There's NFPA 1852, where you have your routine inspections every day or every shift for the packs and the cylinders. And then on top of that, you have your air fill events, hydrostatic tests, flow tests, repairs. So there's a whole nother set of inspections just for the SCBA. And then you get into some of your assets like equipment, hose, for example. NFPA 1962 talks about the standard hose maintenance and the routine inspections. Typically, it's an annual inspection for that one, and then any repairs that go along with it. Hydrants, NFPA 291 talks about the routine hydrant inspections and also the flow tests for the hydrants and repairs. And then you get into kind of some specialty items, aerials, that's as needed depending on the type of vehicle. And then your ladders, obviously, for ground ladders, the routine inspections on those and the repairs. Again, this is just kind of scratching the surface. Like I said, there's a lot of other equipment areas that NFPA touches on in their standards. But when we work with departments to kind of automate their check sheets and the different checklists that they have, I'd say these are the most common ones that almost every department will start with. And if you don't have checklists to start with in these areas, we actually have standard ones that we can provide you, and then we can customize those based on your agency's needs. Okay, so on top of NFPA, I mentioned some other regulations that are in place for fire departments. OSHA, specifically for PPE and SCBA, OSHA has different requirements on what type of gear needs to be issued to the crew members. And I mentioned this before, but OSHA, depending on the state you're in, OSHA may be something you have to follow. Also, depending on the type of agency that you work with or work for, also kind of determines whether you have to follow the OSHA guidelines. Essentially, with OSHA, there has to be an employee-employer relationship. So sometimes with volunteer departments, it doesn't apply in that situation. But there are the PPE and SCBA regulations that they have, or I should say guidelines. And then for Department of Transportation, again, this tends to be state specific, but there are sometimes different checklists or maintenance checks that need to be completed to comply with the DOT guidelines that are put in place for your state. So whatever those might be, we can actually build those into the system for you and customize them on a state-by-state basis. And then finally, if your department is an ALS agency, meaning that you have controlled substances that you're tracking, type 2, type 3, type 4 controlled substances, the DEA is the kind of the overseeing entity for that. And they, of course, have regulations in place for the tracking of those controlled substances from cradle to grave. This is one of the more strict areas, as you can imagine, of the just the different regulations as a fire department that you need to kind of track. But from a controlled substance perspective, basically every handoff event, right? Inventory checks, arriving, departing checks, transfer events, usage events, wastage events, restock events when you get new vials from your vendor. All of that is covered under the DEA regulations. And those checks, the different handoff events need to be documented in order to comply with that. So on top of all the kind of the baseline regulations, right? If your department wants to kind of go above and beyond, and obviously the ISO ratings are a big kind of a scale, right? Kind of a measuring stick of how well you're doing certain things, and maybe where there's opportunities for improvement. But for ISO ratings, the checklists overall come into play, even from that perspective. When they come in and do the ISO audits, they look at things like your vehicles, obviously, what type of inventories are on the vehicles. They look at your hydrant tests, the different flow testings that you've done on your hydrants, looking at all your equipment and the maintenance and the testing that has been done on that. So all of those checklists that we kind of talked about, they also help you improve your ISO rating and will be looked at as part of that process. And I found this chart, which I thought was just kind of interesting, just for reference, across the United States, the different classes of ISO and the different fire departments, and kind of how many fall into each class. So you can see it's kind of a bell curve, if you will. Just a handful of class 1, class 2, class 3, majority of folks in the class 4 to the class 7, range. And then we have a few in class 8, class 9, and class 10. On top of that, particularly if you're an ISO class 1, 2, or 3, a lot of those agencies tend to go through the accreditation process with CPSI. And when CPSI comes in for the accreditation audit and kind of through that whole process, one of the important things they look at as well as operational checks and just the documentation of those, and also the efficiency of how that department is performing those different operational checks. So not so much regulations that these entities are providing, but it ties in with kind of the bigger conversation of how are you doing your checks today? Are you doing them consistently? And how is that information stored and accessed? If you do have to provide it for ISO or for CPSI or for even if there's an accident, right, or an audit, and you have to provide that information to to that entity that's requesting it. So it all kind of ties together. But I thought that was kind of interesting, just looking at the ISO and the CPSI ratings. So kind of despite all that, what's really interesting from our perspective is across the country, about 80% of departments, regardless of the type of agency, we're talking small ones all the way up to the biggest ones in the country, 80% still use paper spreadsheets or kind of, clunky kind of, tied together systems that maybe don't work that well. And so from our perspective, especially when we're looking at a topic like today of checklists and an essential guide, what I did this week is I tried to think about, well, why is that? Why do so many departments still use paper and spreadsheets today? And a lot of it, I think, comes down to complexity, right? There's a lot of these check sheets. We already went through some of them, and I just skimmed the surface, but most agencies, I'd say, have between 25 to 50 different check sheets when you look at your vehicles, your SCBA, your PPE, your assets, your stations, your inventories, your controlled substances, right? There's a lot of these different check sheets that come into play. So that's the first factor. The second factor is, just as an industry, this is and I'm preaching to the choir, I know, but it's a complex industry with multiple crew members on one team, a shift, right? And then you have multiple shifts of people, and they're all sharing the same equipment and doing these checklists together sometimes, and sometimes they're doing it spread out over multiple days. So that adds to the complexity. On top of that, all the regulations that I just showed and talked about, they're all subjective, right? Every single one of them, even the DEA one, which I would say is probably the most strict in terms of an actual regulation. NFPA is more of guidelines, right? But all of them are subjective. So each agency, your agency can read those and interpret them one way, and the agency right next door can read them and interpret them and implement them a completely different way. So it really is the old saying, if you've seen one fire department, you've seen one fire department. Um, there's a lot of commonalities amongst them, right? There's in terms of the types of checklists, but when you actually implement it in terms of the frequency you're doing it, or if you customize the checklist a little bit based on your agency's operations, all of that makes it unique to you. And then on top of the agency uniqueness, there's vehicle uniqueness. Sometimes agencies will have standard inventories across different, across their vehicles, but a lot of times there isn't there isn't standardization, and there is actually uniqueness to some degree across the vehicles. So what I mean by that is essentially, an engine on this side of town might carry different inventories than an engine on the other side of town based on the type of, calls that might be running, or just the specialty vehicle that it is. So that obviously makes it even more complex when you talk about checklists, because particularly on the inventory checklist, every one of those vehicles could be a little bit different, right? Based on what it's carrying at the time. Then on top of that, these are, I'm just kind of layering, layer after layer here. There's different frequencies. So some of these checks happen daily, and those I would say are probably the easiest, right? That, at least talking to the crew members, that's what we hear a lot, is the daily ones are the easiest because we know we have to do them every day and they're consistent, and we just show up and we know we have to do those. But where it gets tricky is when you have weekly checks or monthly checks or annual checks, or things that happen on the first day of the month or the third Wednesday of the month, or whatever it might be. Once you start layering all those different schedules on top of each other, it becomes difficult as a crew member to remember, what do I have to do today? The daily checks, again, those are easy, but on top of that, what else is due right now that I need to complete? And when you think about it, if you have 40, or I'm sorry, well, yeah, let's just call it 40 check sheets, and they all have different schedules, it makes it more, I guess you can see why, some things would slip through the cracks, right? Why some things might not get done or might be forgotten because of just the complexity of all these different things. And when we talk to agencies that are using paper or spreadsheets, and we kind of ask, well, have you done this before? Have you tried to automate these different check sheets? Probably the biggest feedback we get is it's a really big project, right? To try to take all these things and automate them into a system to try to streamline that, especially when you have 50 other projects on your plate, and those kind of take priority sometimes over this type of project. So in terms of just the overall complexity, that's why we see a lot of agencies still using paper spreadsheets. And in terms of a final one, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this saying, but the old verbiage of 200 years of tradition unimpeded by progress, right? That's another big component to this, is just culture change. And how do you get folks on board when you've done things on paper or spreadsheets for 100 years or 200 years? And how do you get them to transition over to an electronic system? All those things kind of play into the conversation. So what we typically see is, if you are still using paper or spreadsheets, these are some of the common challenges that result from that. So you may have missing equipment or lost documentation. Maybe it's hard to budget things because you don't have accurate data. High ongoing IT projects from trying to maintain older systems. Inefficient communication. So if you do have issues at the crew level, how do those get communicated to the folks that are going to be repairing them? And is that an efficient process? A lot of times it might be emails or phone calls back and forth. So just a lot of different challenges across the board, whether you're a crew member, an officer, or on the command staff. And I actually had Liz put together one more poll here. Liz, if you don't mind launching that. And so this is just kind of just out of curiosity, what are some of your biggest challenges that you see when it comes to checklists? And this is actually a multiple choice, so you can select different items if you want to, but we'll let that run here just for a second. And I was just kind of curious because I'll kind of tailor the rest of the presentation to some of the common challenges that you all have. Okay, Liz, I think we could probably close that. Awesome. So this is great. So really good mix, actually. So check consistency, 83%, that was a challenge for. Documentation and reporting, 33%. Kind of intra-departmental communication, so 33% for that. Pencil whipping, that's a big one. We've heard that before, 67% on that. Personnel accountability, 50%, and then other is 17%. Great. Yeah. So those are really good ones. And we'll kind of touch on those as we move through here. If you are new to PSTrax, I wanted to spend just a moment going through a couple slides on how we help with that, right? Essentially, we're a cloud-based system. You can use PSTrax on any device that you have. And we consolidate all those checklists that we just talked about into one system. So all of that data is in one place. And you can track any issues that come up, whether it be a vehicle issue or an equipment issue. Those can be set and then they can be communicated to the right people in the department. We also support barcodes and QR codes if that's a requirement you have. But as it relates to this conversation, I'd say the most important thing about whatever electronic system you use is just being able to access that data, right? Have it all in one place. With PSTrax, you always own the data, so you have full rights and full access to that. So anytime you need to export it or report on it, you can do that. We have 7 different modules. These are a la carte. I won't spend a ton of time on these today, but if your department would like kind of a follow-up demo or meeting, happy to do that for you and to kind of take you through each of the modules. Our vehicle and station modules, you can have unlimited check sheets, checklists. So all of the NFPA checks that we talked about, DOT checklists, OSHA checklists as it pertains to vehicles, all of that can be built out in the system. And you can have the full history of those, right? So if you need to go in and pull up all of your vehicle checks or station checks for whatever time period, the last year or the last 3 years, you can go in and download that. All the maintenance tracking, so the alerts when things break, all that history is in there as well. In addition to the scheduled reports, so if you want to have things scheduled daily, weekly, monthly, we can schedule those to pop up for the crews when they're due, but you can also have as needed checks. So when you get back from a call, if you have other checklists for post-call inventories or things like fuel logs, your daily station log, all those type of checklists can be built in as well. So the crews can just access them as they need. On the equipment side, we kind of bundle PPE, SCBA assets, those 3 modules together. The modules have the same functionality for the most part, but any of the events that you want to log, all the NFPA events, OSHA events, I'm just trying to think, examples being routine inspections, advanced inspections, cleanings, on the SCBA side, air fills, hydrostatic tests, hydrant flow tests, radio software updates, all those kinds of things, hose testings, all those different events can be logged in the system. So that way you have a full history from end to end for each piece of equipment. So if there is an accident, or I know in some states they'll come and do audits and say, hey, show me the history for that item, and they'll point to a specific cylinder or jacket or whatever it might be. You can go in the system and download the history for that item so you can see all those events and any repairs and all the assignments that have gone with it. On top of that, we have holistic reports, is what I call them, kind of macro reports that will show you all these events across your entire department. So similarly, if you have an audit or something like that, or on the ISO side, a good example is your hydrant flow tests. They'll come and ask for all of your hydrant flow test history. you can go in the system and pull that up for the last, year or however long you want to pull it up for. I think it's actually 3 years, if I recall correctly, that ISO looks back. So you could pull the last 3 years of hydrant flow tests and actually see all that information, so that they can use that for your rating. So lots of different kind of tracking aspects to the equipment modules. Expiration dates is another big one, cost tracking. So the initial cost that you paid, as well as the ongoing maintenance costs and the funding source. So if you have any grant funded equipment, we can track that as well. And then finally, the inventory and narcotics modules, sorry, these are more on the EMS side. Obviously, the inventory is tracking all of your consumable supplies. So things like EMS supplies and station supplies. And then narcotics is for the DEA checklist that we talked about. So all of the handoffs of your controlled substance vials, like the arriving, departing check, usage events, transfer events, restock events, all of that's tracked. And both of these modules track the quantity on hand, obviously, but also par levels, lot numbers, and expiration dates for those items. All right. One thing that makes PSTrax unique as it relates to these check sheets is we actually build it all for you. So a lot of other software systems, and you may have experienced this before with other vendors, it's typical for them to give you the software, but then you have to learn it and you have to set it up yourself and, import your data. You have to test it and then roll it out to the crew. So a lot of times, that heavy lifting falls on your shoulders. And that can take a while to build, right? Sometimes it can take months. I've talked with departments where sometimes it never gets built. It just kind of sits on the shelf because, they don't have the resources to get it implemented and rolled out. With PSTrax, we like to do things differently, just realizing that you have a lot on your plate, right? We actually build it completely for you. So all you have to do is email us all of these check sheets. So all the different check sheets we've gone through, if you have 25 or if you have 50 or however many, you can just email us those check sheets in whatever format you have. A lot of times they're in Word documents or Excel documents, Google Sheets, but you can just email those to us and then our team will actually set up your whole software. We configure it for your agency based on the type of checks you want and the frequency that you want. We import all the data for you, and then we help you test it, we train you, and then help you roll it out to the crews. And typically that takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So it's a pretty quick process overall. We go on your timeline, of course. So if you'd like to do things in phases or roll it out over a longer period of time, we can certainly do that as well. But 4 to 6 weeks tends to be kind of a typical timeline for it. On top of that, we provide unlimited support. So again, with other software, vendors, it's pretty typical for them to charge a fee, right? If you need help, like an hourly fee for essentially a consulting fee for any of those ongoing changes. But with PSTrax, all that's included. So anytime you need to replace a vehicle or add additional check sheets into the system, maybe you need to add new equipment that you bought into the system, or if you have a training academy that graduates, you need to add new users. All of those type of operational changes are included as part of the license fee for PSTrax. So there's no additional cost for that. Especially for this conversation with check sheets, those can change pretty frequently, right? Based on the guidelines, like the NFPA guidelines. And so anytime there's updates, we can help you make those updates. That being said, you don't have to rely on us. If you want to go into the system and make those changes yourself, you can certainly do that, and we'll train you on how to do that. All right, really quick, I just wanted to share a case study on San Diego Fire Rescue, and they're a client of ours and have been using PSTrax for about 3 years now. But Just a brief background on their use case. They had been using paper and spreadsheets for over 75 years. They had tried a couple of other electronic systems and just couldn't get them off the ground, or couldn't get them configured enough to use it efficiently. So they ended up going to PSTrax after that experience in 2020, and they rolled out their modules in phases. So kind of a crawl, walk, run approach. And through that process, they're actually able to either automate or eliminate 40 paper check sheets and forms, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. All that, literally, it was all just paper. In San Diego, excuse me, they're a bigger department. They have about 55 stations. I just mentioned that because we see, even in our smaller agencies we work with, we see about the same amount of check sheets, honestly, for a lot of them. So kind of regardless of size, hopefully this kind of, you can relate to this. But San Diego, they actually at FDIC, a couple of weeks back, they did a presentation at FDIC about going paperless with PSTrax, and it was pretty cool. We were pretty pumped on our side that they kind of shared about PSTrax a little bit. But what they did, and I took a couple of the slides from their presentation, they talked about their project of how they went paperless and what their initial goals were with the project. And you can see here, I highlighted some of the key points, but basically they were trying to, move from all these paper sheets to an electronic system that was accessible via the internet, so that they could do their check sheets and also report issues when they came up. And, obviously try to replace the paper forms with a more automated system that would help them with their reporting as well, so that they could capture the data and actually have that data to not only provide when they needed to provide it, but also do trend analysis and other analytics on that data to help them be more proactive as a department. In addition to that, kind of a challenge they had at the time was tracking issues or discrepancies, as they call them, at their department. So when things break, how do you, notify the right people? And previously they were doing that via email and phone calls, essentially. So they were looking for a system to help automate that process as well. And these were the forms that they replaced. So I won't go through all of them, but I'll leave this up just for a second, because I think it's sometimes, at least for me, it's easy to skip over some of these forms in my mind when I'm thinking about all the required, check sheets and checklists. So these were the ones that they identified that they could replace or at least automate by using PSTrax. And I imagine, a lot of you have similar forms. So I just wanted to share it just to give you an idea of how PSTrax could potentially help. So that was one page. And then this was kind of the second page of forms that they had. And you can see it's a lot of different types of things. Like we talked about, everything from vehicles to equipment to stations, inventories, etc. And just to kind of wrap up the slides here, and then I'll hop into a brief demo of the system too, to kind of share what it looks like if you aren't familiar with it. But from our perspective, these are some of the common benefits of paperless checks. So kind of going from paper to a digital system, kind of broken up into those same categories of crews, officers, and command staff. And I won't run through everything right here, but we do actually have a return on investment calculator. And it's pretty detailed, but it can, based on the size of your department, so how many stations you have and how many vehicles you have, it can actually estimate the potential return on investment. So if you're interested in that, just let us know and I can actually send that over to you. We can provide that with the recording as well. But on average, what we see across our customers is about a 700% return in year one alone when they move from paper sheets to an electronic system like PSTrax. And actually in year two, it goes up even higher because you don't have an implementation fee anymore. but it's a pretty remarkable return. And we actually, here at PSTrax, we actually provide a 360-day money back guarantee, which is, I've worked with many software companies and I've never heard of that before. It's pretty unique, but we really believe in the product, and we've never actually had to use that, but we put that into our contracts just to give agencies more assurance that they are going to get a lot of bang for their buck, right, when they sign up for the program. So with that, just really quick, if you are new to PSTrax, just quick background here. We were founded in 2009. We're a privately held company, so we don't answer to VC companies or other shareholders. We're really proud of the fact that we get to answer to our customers and to serve you all. We're based out of Littleton, Colorado. We have about 21 employees now, serve 700 agencies around the United States, Canada, and Australia. And another thing we're really proud of is our 98.5% retention rate or renewal rate, which I think speaks to the system itself being very proven in the space of checklists, but also just our customer service model. We really want to build long-term relationships with all of our agencies, and I think we do a pretty good job of doing that. So yeah, that's a little bit about us, and we'll come back here to upcoming events in a little bit, but I just wanted to hop into the system quickly. And we've talked a lot about these different check sheets, so I just wanted to show you kind of how we build some of those into the system. But before I do that, Liz, I'll just pause for a second, see if there's any questions I can help answer before we hop in here.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. One question that is out there, pretty important question. There's a lot of reports and checklists and things, as we saw on those slides from San Diego. Do we have a guidance or best practice on how to prioritize which reports need to be dealt with first or second, kind of along the lines of that, walk, crawl, run approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to hop back just to help answer that, if I can find the right slide here. I'm going to hop back to this slide just to show the different categories and from our perspective, the different modules. Honestly, it depends. I know this isn't a great answer, but it really does depend on the priority at the agency. A lot of times there's a certain area that's kind of a low-hanging fruit area, or something that's really hot on the radar at the moment, and that can really vary depending on your agency. For example, a lot of times it's the vehicles. The vehicles tend to be a hot ticket item, and from our perspective, we recommend the vehicles as a first module because it gets the crews using the system on a daily basis, right? So in terms of the culture change, it does help get the crew members just being used to going into a system. So that is one that we see commonly started with. But that being said, it really does depend. Like, I talked with an agency last week, and they had basically an audit that failed on their controlled substances, right? So that was kind of their hot ticket item, and they wanted to start with that module. And you can start with multiple modules. I'm just kind of using these as examples. There's another really big agency we talked with a month ago. They're one of the top 4 biggest agencies in the country, actually, but they had an OSHA audit that was failed for an SCBA inspection. And so that was kind of their hot ticket item. So it really does depend. I will say that regardless of what module you start with, it is a best practice to build the modules based on what you're doing today. So whatever check sheets you're doing right now, we can build those identical in the system, right? And the reason that's a best practice is for crew adoption. We don't want to alienate them by building the system too complex right at the beginning, if that makes sense. So we recommend just building it the way you're doing it today. And then what's nice about PSTrax, like I mentioned, is we provide unlimited support. So over time, we can help you evolve the system and keep adding, adding to those checklists or making changes to them over time. So once the crews are bought in, I think you'll be pretty amazed. The crews a lot of times will start suggesting like, hey, why don't we do this in there too? Or why don't we add this to our checklist as well? So as those ideas are kind of brought up, kind of grassroots, if you will, from the crews, we can just kind of keep adding those into the system and keep evolving it. So I hope that answers the question. I know I kind of bounced around there a little bit, but that's probably what we see most commonly is, even if you purchase, sometimes departments will purchase all the modules, but then they'll roll them out in phases, right? So we'll get them all built, but then they'll roll out one at a time. So that way the crews can just kind of slowly be introduced to each module and not be too overwhelmed with too much at once. So thanks, Liz. Yeah, any other questions I can help answer for now?
That's all we've got for now.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I know we just got about 15 minutes here. So I'll hop in the system, and just from a very high level, we'll show kind of how we take those check sheets and checklists and we build them in. And then I'll try to leave about 5 minutes for questions at the end. So coming in here to PSTrax, if this is your first time seeing it, we basically default the crew member to their home station, but they can change locations whenever they need. And what you're seeing here is basically the dashboard for the station that they're located at. So the schedule will show them all the different check sheets that are due right now. And I'd say that's probably one of the most crucial parts of the system. And I spoke to this a little bit earlier, is just helping the crews remember what they have to complete that day. Every day, the daily checks are pretty easy. Those are the same. But in terms of all the other things that come up throughout the year, being able to populate those in a simple place where they can just see if it's due, and if it's due, they can go through and check it off. So that's what we do in the system. And I think that's been really, really beneficial, is just to basically show them when they log in what they have to do. And then their goal is to try to get that down to zero, essentially by the end of the day. So that's the schedule. Also on the homepage, they can see any open alerts. So when they are going through a checklist, if they have an issue, they can set an alert, and then that gets sent out to the right people in the organization. But it also stays here so the crew members can see it, and they can have kind of a work list, if you will, or visibility into those open alerts. So if there's any updates or comments, that they can be notified of those and kind of know what's going on. But a lot of times we hear, for folks that are maybe using paper or spreadsheets, I'll use like a chainsaw as an example, because one time this came up. The chainsaw at station 1 broke, right? So they sent it out to get fixed. And the way they described it is, once it leaves the station, it kind of goes into a black hole of the department, where a lot of times the crew members don't know what's happening to that item. And then magically one day it just shows back up fixed, hopefully, and then they have it back. But the alerts here kind of help resolve that black hole, right? So the crew members can consistently know what's going on with different items, and they can get updates and comments along the way until that issue gets resolved, and then these alerts can get closed out. So those are the alerts. And then the journal on the right is basically a digital whiteboard. So if there's any communications, you can post those up here as well. All right, so maybe I'll start with just a couple of vehicle checklists to show you how we build those. I'm going to hop into engine 1 here and go to edit checklists, just to give you an idea of kind of how we set this up for you when we build it. So essentially all the check sheets that you have as it pertains to vehicles and also stations, we build the station checklist the same way. Basically, you send those over to us, right? And we build them for you. And this is how we build them. We break it down into the check sheet, and then we can break that down even further into task groups and then individual tasks that you want completed. So you can see here for engine 1, we have a daily check sheet, and these are obviously scheduled every day. So what that means is on that homepage I showed you, every day these are going to pop up for the crews to complete. Then on top of that, we have a weekly checklist that's a little more thorough, right? And I should point out, all these are optional, so I'm just kind of showing you some examples here. But here in our demo site, we have a weekly checklist, and these are scheduled every 7 days. So once a week, they'll pop up on the homepage for the crew members to complete. We also have a full monthly inventory. So we have each compartment essentially broken out with the different inventory items and equipment inside of them. Just scroll down so you can see those here. So really, we can go to whatever level of detail you'd like. SCBA checks, obviously those will pop up either daily or once a shift to check out the seat positions on the truck. Fuel logs, if you want to do a fuel log checklist. Some of our departments do a post-call inventory. So when they get back from the fire, they'll have a checklist of their inventories that the crews will go through and mark off just to make sure everything's still there when they get back. So a lot of different examples here, even COVID-19 checklists, kind of a post-call checklist for COVID-19 items. So there's really no limitation. You can have unlimited checklists and unlimited tasks built in here. And like I mentioned before, if you don't have any of these to start with, we have kind of baseline NFPA checklists that you can use as a starting point, and we can load those in for you. But on the vehicle and station side, that's kind of a really quick showing of how we kind of build those checklists in there. And I wanted to show on the asset side for like PPE and SCBA and assets, all the different events, which an event is basically a check sheet, right? That you want to document. But for PPE, for example, any type of event that you want to track, we can build that in the system. So there's obviously some standard NFPA ones like your routine inspections. And then you can see here, based on the type of gear, we can set up different tasks or different types of checks that go along with that event. So our helmet routine inspection will include these tasks, but our hood routine inspection will be a little bit different, as will our gloves and our jacket. They're going to have different tasks associated with that. So we have a routine inspection, we have a post-call inspection, a cleaning and advanced inspection, a repair and exposure event here on our demo site. But any other events that you want to track, we just load those into the system. And then when you go to actually perform the event, it'll document into the history for that item. Same thing with SCBA, all the different events that you want to track, routine inspections, air fills, repairs, flow test, hydrostatic event, any of those items we can set up here in the system for you. And then the assets is kind of a fun one, because obviously there's a lot of different types of assets. So we can create different event types based on the type of asset. So you might just have a basic inventory check, like, hey guys, go out and just make sure it's still here, right? That it's present. But then there might be certain things that you have. Here's a good example. I want to find, like, a hose is a good example. This is an event that's specific just to hose, but our annual hose testing event, we can set that up and then log that for all of our hose. So you can see here, hydrant, flow tests, hydrant routine inspections, radio software updates, roof inspections, literally whatever type of event that you'd like to track or checklist that you'd like to track within the system, we can set that up. And I know I kind of buzzed around there a little bit, but basically all that information gets documented in the system. So when the crews go in and it says, hey, you have 97 vehicle checks to complete, they can just click in and go right down the list, right, of completing their checks. And they don't have to complete them all right then. If they get called out to a fire, they can just log what they've done and document those tasks. And then that'll come off their schedule. So basically all those different events and check sheets that I just showed you, once we set them up and we schedule them, they pop up right here for the crews to complete. And then the crews just go through and complete those different items. And once they've completed them, the powerful thing about the system and kind of the whole purpose behind it is all of the logs and all of that history is right here in one place, right? So for your vehicle and station logs, as an example, we can pull up Engine 1 and say, you know, show me a particular checklist that we've done, or show me everything. And it'll pull up every single check that we've done, and we can see who did it, what time it was completed, if it was done on time or if it was late. That's what the green dot indicates. And then all this information can be exported or printed if needed. So all of your vehicle and station checklists, this is how you could report on those. Same thing with the equipment modules. We can go into the logs, like on our PPE, if we want to look up all of our advanced inspections that we've done this year or this month. You can go as far back as you want. I guess we can do this year. Whoops, back a couple years there. There we go. And this will be kind of a macro report for all of your PPE equipment and show you every advanced inspection that you've done. So we've just done 3 here in our demo site, but SCBA, same thing. You can go in and pull up your macro report for any of these events or checklists that you've tracked. So hydrostatic test is a big one. So we can pull that up and see. Oh, looks like we don't have any for that date range. I'll do air fills. That's another common one. There we go. So there's all of our air fills for the month of May, and then we can just export that information if we ever need to. And assets as well. So all of your asset types, I know the hydrant flow test is a big one for the ISO ratings. So you could literally pull up your flow tests here and, you know, select your date range. You can go back 3 years if you want. Actually, I will go back a year because I don't think we have too many of those logged in our demo site. See if we get any here, but essentially all the history just like that will pop up, and you can filter it further using any of these columns if you'd like. But that's how all the checklist, you know, once it gets performed, where all the checklist history goes is kind of through in those different reports that you can download and export anytime you need to. So going back to San Diego, when they, you know, essentially got rid of those 40 paper forms, all that information just goes into the system, and then you can access it anytime and have that documentation, whether it be for an audit or an accident or for proactive analysis, right? To look at trends and to try to plan into the future for certain things. All right, Liz. Well, I think that's probably as much as we'll get through today on the demo side of things. And I know that was a lot, everyone. So thanks so much for hanging with me through that. We touched on a lot of different things. It is kind of a tough topic to boil down into 1 hour with, you know, all the different areas that you guys handle and the different checklists. So I hope that was, you know, beneficial and valuable for you. Like I mentioned before, if you would like a demo for your department or pricing or any other information, Liz has a poll here we'll launch, and you can just let us know on there. But a lot of times we'll do kind of a virtual Zoom demo or overview if your agency would like to learn more. So just let us know and we can do that get that set up for you. But I think that's all I had, Liz. I'll hand it back over to you if you want to run through some of the upcoming events here. I'll try to get to that slide for you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. We've got some great events coming up for the May and June. We're going to do another general overview of PSTrax coming up May 17th. That's next Tuesday, where we just do like a 30,000 foot view of everything PSTrax does, and we cover the why PSTrax in there. June 7th, we have how to track expiration dates for multi-year budget planning. So this one's really cool. Ryan is going to be on this one again, and we're going to just go over how all of the checks that you do can translate into reporting that can help you budget for this year, next year, or whatever else you need. And then June 14th, we have another general overview. We try to pop those in frequently so that people can hop on and check those out. So we'll have links to each of these in the follow-up email, which hopefully you'll get either this afternoon or tomorrow. Otherwise, you can always check us out at pstrax.com and navigate to our events page under resources and sign up there as well. So that's all we have on our end. We'll let everybody go about 2 minutes early. Woo. Be safe out there, take care, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.